Welcome back to In Conversation with Christina. Today, we are going to be diving into all things ADHD, nutrition, and eating disorders with our expert guest, Nina. Nina and me actually go way back, and we've known each other for many, many years. But I actually worked with her through my own struggles with an eating disorder when I was kind of navigating that. And she helped me so incredibly much. And I just learned so much from her that I've still stayed in contact with her over the years, and I still value her expertise so much. Now, fortunately for myself, she is now my mentor as well in this space in working with eating disorders and things like that. So we have known each other for many different years through different seasons, but that's a little background to how I know my guest today. But what I really wanted to do is really bring her on because she has such a wealth of knowledge when it comes to eating disorders. She specializes in binge eating and ADHD, which I think is a huge topic that we're only kind of just getting into over the last few years. So I'm going to get her to introduce herself shortly. But today, this conversation is really going to be about how ADHD affects different eating patterns across eating disorders and also some strategies around how do you kind of navigate ADHD and the different food-related challenges that can come with that. But as always, I also hope that this episode is going to leave you feeling encouraged, educated, and empowered to step into something new, whether that's in your recovery journey, whether that's in your career, or simply just with your relationship to yourself. And if you do find this episode helpful, I would love if you would share it with a friend and also tag us both on Instagram. But I would like to welcome Nina to the show, and I thank you so much for being here today. But to kick things off, I would love if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and what led you to specialize in ADHD and binge eating.
Hey, Christina, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm really excited. I guess I almost forgot how far back we went, right? Like I've seen you go through so many different stages of your life and worked with you in so many different capacities. And now it's reaching to that point now where it's really feeling like we can bounce ideas off each other. And now look at you inviting me to your podcast. It's so cool seeing how our friendship and our relationship has grown over the last few years. I'm excited to be here. So a little bit about me. So my name is Nina. I'm a dietitian, and my interest in dietetics actually started because of my own disordered relationship with food. So, through trying to go on a diet, trying to control my body, trying to be really thin, I accidentally slipped into an eating disorder. And it first started with an obsession with the gym, obsession with trying to lose weight, and I guess what you'd call orthorexia, although I didn't realize it at the time. Over some time that progressed, it turned into binge eating disorder and then bulimia, and I struggled with that alone for quite a bit. And I decided to quit my job because my eating disorder got so bad it actually impacted my ability to work in my job. And I decided to study nutrition, thinking it was going to make me the best dieter in the world. I think this is a really common story that we hear amongst dietitians and nutritionists, right? They start off with this obsession, turns into a learning. And from there, I was actually able to overcome my eating disorder by myself. I was too ashamed to get support. But even when I got better, even when I was no longer binge eating, when I worked on my body image, things still felt a little bit hard. And I remember doing my master's of dietetics, and I got to my first year and I just hit meltdown city. I was having panic attacks, anxiety attacks. I was finding the work really, really challenging, even though I loved the work. I loved learning about food and nutrition. And when I went to get support for the first time ever, I saw a psychologist. On the very first session, she was like, "Have you ever considered that you might have ADHD?" And I was like, "No, absolutely not. I am not a little wriggly, naughty white boy who is hyperactive and bouncing off the walls. You're insane." Until I went up and did a little bit of my own research. And after a few weeks, I came back and saw her and I was like, there might be something here. But even then, I was a little bit like, brushed it off to the side, finished my degree. And then I was excited to be a brand new dietitian, and I got all these jobs. And unfortunately, COVID hit and I lost all of these jobs because they simply didn't exist anymore. So I started creating an Instagram page, sharing my own story with binge eating and body image, which accidentally became a business. People started working with me, and it progressed into working with binge eating. And then through there, I discovered that so many of my clients had ADHD. And I was like, this is strange. Started doing that research to learn how connected eating disorders, ADHD, and binge eating are. So that's where it's brought me to today, now specializing in binge eating disorder and ADHD, and people who struggle with disordered relationships with food.
Wow. And it's yeah, such a story. And I think it's almost such a beautiful thing how it's like you can go through something that is challenging and hard to then support others walking through that same journey. And I think that's why, as you said, lots of people do eventually get into this space where they are working with people that they once struggled with, or in conditions or situations that they once struggled in. So it can be such a beautiful thing that you can kind of bring into your practice as well. I love that early journey of how you've kind of navigated it for yourself and then been able to, find this space in dietetics where you feel fulfilled and you feel like you're really able to make that impact on something that I can imagine at one time was probably very debilitating and overwhelming and all the different things for you. For those that actually might not even be familiar with ADHD, can you give just a short overview of what ADHD is and then also how it impacts like daily life?
So ADHD, I think most people have heard of ADHD, but they have associated it as like a behavioral issue that they would typically see in like the naughty little boy in the classroom, as I've alluded to. So it's associated with hyperactivity, impulsivity, people who couldn't pay attention. But as ADHD knowledge has progressed, people are starting to realize that it's actually more of a neurodevelopmental condition and a brain difference, and it continues into adulthood. Everybody with ADHD presents really differently, especially women. We're starting to discover that hyperactivity is actually internalized. But the symptoms I see are usually pretty similar across the board in the sense of like the common stuff like difficulties staying focused, managing time, organization, working memory, prioritization, that sort of stuff that is really important for day-to-day functioning. And although it's not quite recognized in the diagnostic criteria yet, emotional dysregulation, we're starting to realize, is a big part of ADHD. And all of these things together, plus the impulsivity, leads to difficulties with mental health, difficulties with relationship, work, self-care, daily routines, and all of that. So it impacts basically every part of daily life if you have it.
Yeah. And I can imagine, I guess, what even I see on social media at the moment is there's more awareness around it. More education around it, but people like understanding that are like, okay, cool, I'm struggling with all these things and I have all my life, and there are actually some reasons why. And I think sometimes that then can empower people to then be like, okay, how can I kind of work with this? What tools can I develop? And what things do I need to know to kind of navigate just daily life, right? And all the different things that we need to do. When we kind of go back to ADHD, how does it influence eating behaviors and patterns? And is there any common eating habits or challenges that do tend to emerge in individuals with ADHD?
Yeah, the tricky thing about ADHD is that it impacts just about every single step of the nutrition process, like from planning to cooking to going to the grocery store to even eating the food. Every step is impacted because it requires a lot of organization and planning. And because of this, a lot of the clients that I work with that have ADHD present with a few similar core challenges, even though they all have their differences amongst that. So the most common core challenges that I'll see is irregular eating, and that can happen for a variety of reasons. So it could be, just the generic like lack of planning, organization. It can also be due to forgetfulness. It can be due to feeling overwhelmed and disorganized. And so that comes up in a lot of different ways. Sometimes that's intentional, so through the disordered eating pathway, and we could talk a little bit more about that down the track. And sometimes it's unintentional, like they're doing the best they can, but they simply don't just forget to eat. And there's also under and overeating, again, for a logistical and emotional reasons. So there can be a lack of interoceptive awareness where they don't feel their hunger and fullness cues. Maybe they are hyper-focused on their work and they forget to stop and listen to their hunger, for example. And vice versa, if they are overeating, sometimes it's they're not feeling their fullness cues. They started their meal too hungry because of their undereating during the day, or it's that dopamine seeking behavior that can come up where it's really, really hard to stop once you start eating. There is also the emotional regulation component. So just the general, because there is emotional dysregulation, there's a lot more soothing to cope with, using food to soothe and cope with emotions. There's also dopamine seeking and stimming with food. And often this leads to a really big imbalance between the amount of sugary, salty, fatty, crunchy, delicious, high reward dopamine foods that somebody eats in comparison to perhaps the whole foods that require a lot more planning, organization, more likely to go to waste because it can go off and things like that. But lastly, the other thing I'm going to mention is like the mindset challenges that I see that are really common in ADHD, and that's things such as black and white thinking, because of the lack of cognitive flexibility in their brain, can lead to perfectionism, avoidance of rejection, trying to control food as a way to manage how the world perceives them. And they have these really high expectations of what it means to look to eat healthily. And often they don't actually have the capacity, ability to actually follow through with that. One, because it's too hard and unreasonable. And two, because of all of the cognitive challenges they have in planning, organization, etc. It all kind of feeds into itself. So many ways that ADHD impacts food. And even though they're not unique to ADHD, they are exacerbated with ADHD.
Yeah, even from a practitioner standpoint, I think understanding this is so important because lots of dietitians, I wouldn't say all of them, but lots of dietitians get into this space because they love food, they're big foodies. And so it's like when you're then met with clients where, the simple things around eating, planning, like meals is overwhelming, it's actually really important to understand all the different complexities that come with this as well. But could you give, and I led into this just before around how, you can be under eating, overeating, but in the context of eating disorders, could you, I guess, elaborate a bit more on how ADHD can affect people and how it can then play out in binge eating disorder and then also in anorexia nervosa?
Yeah. Because of all the challenges that we just talked about, a lot of ADHDers struggle with food in general. And unless they kind of revolve their whole life around food and obsess around food, it becomes their special interest. It's very difficult for them to consistently maintain the kind of healthy eating they think that they should do. And because of that, they tend to fall into some kind of disordered eating pattern. There's either the highly obsessive, highly controlling, usually more of the anorexic kind of eating disorder archetype, where food becomes their whole personality, but body becomes their whole personality because that's the only way that they can maintain that behavior they want. Or it becomes the more binge eating archetype where they can't follow through with that, they're forgetting to eat, etc. But I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But I think first it's important to know that ADHD is linked to all eating disorders, and it's a much higher risk of eating disorders for people with ADHD for a variety of reasons. The highest ones are EDNOS and bulimia, but the next one is binge eating disorder and anorexia. And just to give a little bit of an idea of how big this is, roughly 30% of people with binge eating disorder meet screening criteria for ADHD. I think it's even higher than that, compared to roughly 5% of the general population who have ADHD. So it's massively overrepresented. Why? That is, it's important to understand why people develop eating disorders. So I'm not going to go too deep, but essentially it's all about coping. Eating food is a tool to cope. Eating food is a way to soothe or to manage yourself or control your emotions, for example. But obsessing about food and body is also a tool to cope. So is restricting food and trying to control your body. So ultimately, all of it is a false sense of control that you're trying to create. And who feels really out of control in their life, generally feels a lot of chaos, is ADHDers. So their need to cope and to control and manage life is much higher. And they tend to not score very highly on having good coping tools, having good emotional regulation, and having good self-compassion. They tend to score quite low on that. And there's a lot of self-blame of when you can't cope. Now, if you're obsessing about food and your body, your world becomes very small, becomes very manageable, and your problems have a really clear, specific solution. Because if your problem is something bigger of I suck, or if I'm not good at work, or my life is chaos, or I'm not worthy, I'm not valuable, I'm not good enough. How do you fix that? It's too big. It's too hard. It's impossible to fix. But if your problem is, well, if I could eat perfectly and if I could look perfect, then all my problems will go away, because at least if I suck, people will see me as valuable. They'll see me as beautiful. They'll be nicer to me, and they will accept me even if I do feel a little bit weird or awkward, or if I'm not smart. I'll just be accepted, and that will protect you from the rejection that you think you're going to get from society. So essentially, it's ultimately a tool to cope. Now, I wonder if you also have a little bit of insight into that. So any of your clients have ADHD, or any other reason you think your clients get anorexia or bulimia. What do you think is going on?
Yeah, definitely work with clients that do experience ADHD. And it's that thing where this eating disorder becomes their whole identity. It becomes their whole personality. It becomes this way of, like, as you said, if I look perfect, if I be perfect, if I do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to be accepted, and I'm going to not get rejected, and all these different things. I also see it come up a lot around like the emotion and the coping mechanism for something where, as you said, having ADHD feels very out of control, it feels very chaotic. it provides that sense of safety for them. And that's why I guess it becomes these really ingrained patterns and beliefs. And I think even the tools that you would use with someone that has ADHD, as we talk about emotional regulation, self-compassion, all those tools are exactly the same tools as well we are using with people who don't experience ADHD, because I think on whole, like these tools are a lot of the tools around eating disorders, but we do know that things can be a lot harder and more challenging for those who do struggle with ADHD. One thing that you did touch on that I thought was important, and I'd love to just ask a question further about, is kind of this self-blame piece and people with ADHD really going back to blaming themselves for whether they're not eating perfectly, whether they missed a meal, whether they ate too much, right? Like go different ways. When you have a client that's maybe really struggling with blaming themselves constantly around food or their behaviors, or even just living with ADHD, where do you start with that and where do you go with that to help support a client that may really struggle with just that inner critic that is super loud?
Yeah, that's a really hard one, dealing with the blame, shame, especially if that's something that they've learned to live with for their whole life. Often this is stuff that started in teenagerhood, but even in childhood, people have basically learned that, you suck, it's all your fault, it's your willpower, you just need to try harder. And it becomes quite challenging to undo that programming. So my very first step is working with that and helping them understand that this is your programming and giving them a little bit of science behind that. So for example, in particular, I like to share with them that, most of them will say, it's my willpower. I don't have enough willpower. I just need to try harder. And I look for evidence in their life where that's not true, because I don't know about you, but well, actually, I'm sure of it, that most of my clients are very successful in other areas of their life. They're so successful. They are these wonderful, incredible humans. So clearly they don't have a willpower problem. I look for it in their personal life. And then I look for it also in the research as well. And I can tell them very clearly, they've actually tested for whether willpower is a factor in how likely someone is to have an eating disorder and recover from an eating disorder. And there is no correlation there. So you can't argue with the science there. So I'll start with validation. Of course you feel that way. Of course you're going to think it's your fault and blame yourself when you have all this evidence for years where you tried and it didn't work, or you weren't successful in whatever you were doing. You start there. And then you go, and let's start creating brand new evidence to prove that that's not true for you, and, educating around that piece. I like to talk about with my clients. I actually tell them to imagine you've got this book of evidence, and every single time they do something that proves that they are actually are capable, or it's not their willpower, or it's not their fault, I ask them to imagine like that's a really big thing that they've glued into their book of evidence for against that. So next really important one is self-compassion. Self-compassion, I think, is the most important tool in eating disorders, especially for ADHD. And actually the research in self-compassion shows that regardless of somebody's mental state, if they've improved or whatever it is, self-compassion can greatly improve their quality of life, their coping capacity, and ability to actually take action and make change. And that's especially important in ADHD because a lot of people get really stuck and be too scared to take action because they don't trust that they are capable. So really, really important to focus on self-compassion as well. For example, in my situation, binge eating is learning how to, after the binge, forgive and forget, understand why their brain goes into this overdrive of beating themselves up, and to forgive and forget. So understand why they binged, or in your case, your clients, it might be why they restricted, or why they stepped on the scale when they weren't supposed to, for example, and cause themselves to get very upset. Understand why that happens, forgive and forget, and have an action plan for how to reduce the likelihood of that happening, to break the cycle and make it less likely to fall into that shame, self-blame, binge, restrict, for example, cycle.
Yeah. And exactly what you said. It's like validating, educating on why that happens, right? Why do we go to blame? Our brains have this negative bias, right? And constantly, if you are experiencing an eating disorder, like there's probably a lot of that, like perfectionism thinking, the all or nothing thinking, the black and white, like all of those things that contribute to these cycles of like, you're not doing good enough. You need to be doing more, right? This self-blame. So I think those keys around, and especially bringing in that compassion piece, I think it's so underrated. And I think sometimes how can we actually empower and educate clients to like implement it? And I think when you come from that perspective, change is then more likely to happen because it's not this cycle of I did something wrong. Okay, it's my fault. I'm the issue. It's like, okay, actually maybe this pattern we can change. And that's what I was about to say, is that I love that you have so many practical tools and you have so many tools with your clients. And I know you mentioned earlier around ADHD, it often involves this impulsivity and it involves this emotional dysregulation. How do those, I guess, traits influence the binge eating and the anorexia nervosa? I mean, some might be different, some might be the same, but how does ADHD make it harder for individuals to regulate their eating behaviors when there is this impulsivity, when there is this emotional dysregulation?
This is a really hard one. This is the reason why people with ADHD, when they experience an eating disorder, they actually experience it with a greater severity, and overcoming it can be a little bit more challenging because they might really want to recover and want to do all the things to get past it. But then the logistical side of actually implementing that is challenging. And then the impulsivity and the emotional regulation can tip everything upside down. So in regards to emotional regulation, if you're emotionally dysregulated, you actually can't harness the part of your brain that is responsible for the rational thinking. So one of the strategies used in overcoming eating disorders is CBT. So cognitive behavioral therapy, really identifying your unhelpful thinking patterns, challenging them, reframing them, and basically thinking your way differently, reprogramming the way that your brain works. However, if you are emotionally dysregulated and get emotionally dysregulated easier by things that are not that wouldn't potentially upset somebody else, and it takes you longer to recover from that emotional dysregulation, you have a much smaller window in your life where you are able to harness your rational brain. So you're constantly working with your irrational brain, and sometimes with my clients, I call it the orange brain, and I use kind of the polyvagal theory as a conceptual model. It's not really how the nervous system works, but as a conceptual model for them to understand, are you thinking with your rational brain where you can do the CBT and the reframing, or are you thinking with your dysregulated emotional brain? Yeah, they just can't think. Like they can't, when they're there, they just can't like go, this is an unhelpful thought, I'm going to think this instead. Their brain is going, this is an emergency, everything sucks, and I just need to react and survive. And often that survival tool involves something that they have an impulsive reaction to. So they're not able to have an emotion, notice it, and choose how to react. They react in the moment impulsively. And usually for my clients, especially, they turn to food, for example, and then that's followed by regret. So it's very important for them to work on their emotional regulation and be able to catch themselves before they're in those orange dysregulated zones. What I find, so at the start of my program working with clients, I will work on emotional dysregulation, and I don't deal with the impulsivity around ADHD until the end because it's inherently a part of how we work. And no amount of tools and strategies is going to change our brain. You can work on your emotional regulation. You're still somebody who gets emotionally dysregulated easier, but you can create a life where you can function a bit better without so much emotional explosivity. Impulsiveness is a part of the way your brain works. And what can happen is they have all the right intentions and they simply forget that they have this goal to do something a certain way. They were going to have this snack in the afternoon, but they walk past the cafe and like, oh, a cookie, they get a cookie. So for them, for ADHDers, it's really important to make room for error and a multi-catchment system. It's all about setting yourself up for success to reduce your impulsivity where you can, reduce your opportunities to make an impulsive choice, and also make room for error. So if you accidentally ate the cookie and you didn't realize until you're halfway through, go, what am I going to do? So you don't just go, oh, fuck it, I stuffed up, and eat the whole cookie and get another one. You plan for that. Cool. What's going to happen when you're halfway through the cookie? How are you going to deal with that? What's going to happen when you got to the end of that cookie and you realize, how are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with it if you stuffed up and you ate all the cookies? Then you're going to go through the self-compassion tools, the let go tools, and the, plan to reduce the likelihood of happening it again.
And I love everything that you just said. And I think what's really key is like coming back to this piece of self-compassion. Like every one of us, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to set out with the best intentions. But sometimes life doesn't happen, right? It doesn't happen the way we planned and things happen. And being able to pull on that self-compassion piece, that's so important when it comes back to someone's relationship with food and their body. And it comes back to navigating ADHD with that is like, what plan are we going to have? How are we going to navigate the thing that, we can try so hard not to happen, but it also may just happen. Like, how do we actually navigate that? And I think that's so, so important. And the other thing you did touch on is obviously this emotional dysregulation piece and how when someone is in that heightened state, right, like the flight and fight state, they can't cognitively think themselves out of that, right? They can't, tell themselves stop, right? Like it's just happening. The body's reacting. All the systems are firing. What are some strategies that you use to help people and your clients get out of that state, right? Like get out of that state of that really heightened distress, emotional dysregulation that you find even personally for yourself that may work, and things that potentially work for your clients as well.
Yeah. So these tools are, I would say, the same regardless of if someone has ADHD or not. However, I will kind of give a bit of insight on how it might look differently for ADHDers to implement this because of their challenges with memories, etc. So the way I look at it is if you are in the orange zone, so if you are dysregulated, your capacity to deal with your brain is not very high. So instead, what you need to do is you need to get out of your brain and into your body. So first recognize like what is going on and say to yourself, I am dysregulated. It helps if you then spend a bit of time describing sensations in your body if you can. Some ADHDs really struggle with this, especially people with autism will struggle with this, that interoceptive awareness, but starting to be like, I can feel my heart is fluttering, I'm sweaty, I'm breathing up high in my chest, I'm feeling all sorts of things. And even if you don't have the words for it, just saying, I feel yuck. And I don't like this, and I'm noticing I'm wanting to do whatever I can to get out of it. My brain is spinning, but getting out of your brain first and into your body, and then addressing your body's needs. I then have a kind of like a categorization of tools. I have emergency tools, and this is like when you notice you are in fight or flight mode, or you're really stuck or whatever it is, you harness your emergency tools. And my top 3 favorites are, so temperature. So get an ice pack, put it on your neck, something like that, back of your neck. Sometimes I like to marry this up with food. And so for me personally, one of my favorites that I use for myself and for my clients is an icy pole or like an ice lolly, whatever you call it. So you're holding something cold, you put something cold on your neck. And what that does is it triggers the vasovagal reflex and tells your body to get out of fight or flight and relax. It's like part of the reason why people do ice baths, right? That's one of them. The other one is to put your face in water. So you can actually do this little experiment if you have one of those like fit watches or whatever. Trigger warning, if you are in eating disorder recovery, don't do this unless you have been advised it's okay to have your fit watch. But if you put it on just for this, put your face in some water. It especially helps if it's cold water. You trigger the mammalian dive reflex and your body's preparing you to be underwater. So it's conserving energy and your heart rate will slow down. It kind of tries to get you out of fight or flight. So that helps as well. You're dealing with your body sensations. The third one is breathing. Often people will notice they're breathing. I'll ask, where are you breathing? They're like, I'm up high in my chest. I'm like, oh, can you bring that breathing further down low? Take a big, big breath. And I really like triangle breathing. So 4 seconds in, 7 seconds hold, 8 seconds out. And I specifically like this for ADHD because something like box breathing is not complicated enough to keep your brain focused. I will try box breathing and I'll just forget what I'm doing and I'll start thinking about something else. But triangle breaths is just complicated enough that you have to focus. Those are my 3 emergency tools. And food. Use food like an intentional, effective tool. Emotionally eat on purpose with intention. So I think for me personally, and I know that this isn't for every practitioner, I think food should always be an emotional eating tool and that you should learn how to use it in a way that is effective and productive and isn't going to get overdone. So I think for ADHD, this is where there's a slight difference with ADHD is there is a part of our brain that inherently just needs to stim. It needs dopamine, and sometimes food is the best way to do that. So including dopamine foods. So my favorites are ginger, because it's very spicy, it's strong. Gum, strong minty gum. Those seaweed things, they're really crunchy. Chewing on ice cubes, anything that's going to give you a big sensory input, and stop and eat that food. Have a mindful eating bite. One of my clients, as I was teaching her about mindful eating and emotional eating, she was making fun of me because I was trying to teach her how to emotionally eat. And I was like, make a whole thing of it. Go get your chocolate, eat it. And she's like, all right, I'm going to go and I'm going to make sweet, sweet love to my ice cream. And she turned the lights down. She put the music on and she was taking the piss out of me. And she's going to make sweet, sweet love to my ice cream now. And she's like, Nina, I'm so annoyed. It worked. 3 Magnum ice things and genuinely wasn't satisfied, felt guilty and wanted more. So she would have one, sometimes she even had half, put it away, the other half the next day. She was like, who even am I? All because she allowed herself to use food as an emotional regulation tool. Those are my 4 emergency tools.
But yeah, I love everything that you just said. And I think even that point around making emotional eating like okay. And if it's a thing that you're going to go to, that is fine. We want to make sure we have a whole toolbox of different things. It's not the only thing we go to when we feel distressed. But if you're going to choose to emotionally eat, that's fine, right? But how can we do that mindfully? Because I think, again, it takes that shame of like, okay, cool. Like I'm emotionally eating, not because I don't have enough willpower, but because I'm distressed right now and my body's just trying to grab something. I would actually love to maybe dive into a bit of a conversation around dopamine and how does dopamine play a role? I know you have touched on this a little bit in regards to like food. How does it play a role in both ADHD and eating disorders?
So basically, for people who don't know, dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it is responsible for feelings of motivation and reward. It lights up the brain like a Christmas tree. You can see it, and it's like a pleasure hormone as well. So it is actually responsible for why people do their work, why they get up, why they do anything in their day. So everybody is affected by dopamine. The thing about ADHD is your dopamine is a bit lower. So you spend your whole day, your whole life, I guess, constantly seeking out sources of dopamine, seeking out stimulation just to bring your dopamine up to baseline. Because what can happen is if you have low dopamine or if something is not giving you dopamine, one, you can't do it because there's no doing hormone to do it. It can cause feelings of depression, low motivation, just being uninspired. So people with eating disorders, they're also going to be impacted by dopamine and they're also going to be impacted by mental health issues as well. So they can also feel depression, low motivation, etc. So the way that this really shows up for ADHD in particular is that constant dopamine seeking leads to constantly seeking out the sugary, sweet, delicious, yummy foods. It also is what makes it really hard to stop eating when something is very yummy. So, it's like, you could have stopped eating that salad when you were full, but if it was pizza, like it's much easier to eat past fullness. So understanding that the yummier something is, the less reliable your self-control, impulsivity, and your fullness signals are going to be can be really, really helpful. So in the eating disorder space, what's really important to know about dopamine is the longer you go without eating, the higher your hormone ghrelin is, your hunger hormone. And the higher your hunger hormone ghrelin is, the higher your dopamine drive is, and the greater your dopamine response to food. So if you go a long time without eating, if you're not eating enough, and then you eat some chocolate, you've created a really, really strong reward pathway in your brain. And now your brain is going to be like, give me chocolate. It's going to desperately want that hit. And if you're constantly depriving yourself of joy, of food, of pleasure, which a lot of people with eating disorders do, they kind of punish themselves in a way like that they can't do the fun thing. Either they don't have the energy, the motivation, they're lacking sources of dopamine, and they're going to get it from obsessing about food or stepping on the scales, because stepping on the scales is a dopamine machine as well. Like it's Russian roulette, right? It's like playing the pokie machines. So understanding that you're creating an environment in your brain where you're going to enhance dopamine seeking and create a stronger reward pathway with binging is really important.
Yeah. And how do you, for someone that struggles with ADHD and obviously then like navigating, dopamine and how that plays a role in all the things, how does someone that is struggling with an eating disorder, whether it is binge eating, whether it is anorexia nervosa, how do you start to like replace the things they are going to for dopamine?
So let's just start with there are some really unhelpful dopamine tools, just really quickly. So we have obviously the food, like the binge eating, etc. There's also phone addiction, caffeine addiction, and abuse, alcohol abuse, drugs, that sort of stuff, risky behaviors. They can all give us dopamine. And a lot of people with ADHD and eating disorders tend to lean into these as a way to get their dopamine to cope and things like that. Some healthier ways to do that, I like to categorize it into 3 categories. So I like to have a food dopamine toolbox. What are some foods that can give you dopamine that are not going to cause a significant consequence to your health, your appetite, and things like that? There is a trigger warning here because sometimes the foods that are on this list do sound a little bit diety. So you have to be careful. Are you using this food as a healthy, helpful dopamine tool, or are you using it as an appetite suppressant tool? Really important. The second category is non-food things. So that might include things, crossing something off of your to-do list, seeing a friend, patting your dog, doing some movement, engaging in a hobby. This is why, to overcome your eating disorder, it's also really important to engage in hobbies and social connection. You want to be able to get enough dopamine and oxytocin, because the oxytocin inhibits like addiction type feelings, to actually help with that. So having a toolbox like that as well is helpful. And then the third category is general life habits and routines that will improve your dopamine. So getting enough sleep, getting enough movement, yada, yada, that sort of stuff.
And I love all of those. And I love how you even brought in, like, I guess, the challenges that someone navigates when it comes to the dopamine picture, which I guess is one part of navigating ADHD and all the different things, and how, managing an eating disorder and being able to give them these strategies that allows them to still get the same, I guess, effect that they would get out of food, but in ways that are healthier, and setting up their environment and planning, and doing all of those different things. When it comes to managing ADHD and eating disorders, I know we just touched on some of those tools around like dopamine, but is there any other tools or approaches that you find really helpful that you can help people that do struggle both with ADHD and eating disorders?
The sky's the limit here, and it really depends on the person, right? So I think with ADHD in particular, actually, I'll say it's for both, is getting really creative and thinking outside the box, thinking about what's right for you. So getting to know yourself, your needs, your triggers, your coping tools really, really deeply, so you know what you need and what tools are going to be helpful. That would be the most important. Self-reflection and mindfulness. As much as ADHD is roll their eyes at mindfulness, it doesn't mean you're sitting there meditating. It just means you know yourself deeply. That is the most important. And I guess the tools for that would be potentially tracking, writing down what are your triggers, that sort of stuff. The general mindfulness stuff that we all know but have difficulty implementing. Another tool is definitely self-compassion, practicing it as a skill, whether you believe it's true, if it works or not, overcoming the negative barriers that you have towards self-compassion. So, like, for example, the belief that if you're self-compassionate, you've let yourself go, because it's simply not true. So leaning in. What would you say to a friend? What would I say if I was a child? If I was, what would I say to a stranger? Those sorts of self-compassion tools. And Kristen Neff actually has a free website with free resources on self-compassion. So I highly recommend that people go and actually check that out if you're interested, and listen to her book to learn that. Small changes, small achievable steps. Now, in the eating disorder space, there is this major archetype of perfectionism, of black and white thinking. You want to do it all, and you want to do it now, and you want to do it perfectly. And if there is a risk of failure, you're either going to freak out and stop trying and avoid it, or you are going to beat yourself up and be really horrible, mean to yourself. So small, achievable steps. Pick 1 to 2 things each week that you're going to focus on. And if you're not eating regularly, everything has to be about eating regularly. Nothing else matters. That is your baseline, focusing on your baseline. Obviously, the most important tool, your support network, making sure that you have somebody that you're working with, because eating disorder recovery is slow. It is step by step. And it can be very tedious and challenging to keep pushing forward through the hard parts and the slow bits without somebody there basically telling you what to do.
Yeah. And I guess that's even like a common challenge point that I see when I am working with someone that has ADHD and they're navigating an eating disorder, is the fact that it just feels too overwhelming. There's too much going on. And it's just like, in a way, they can become very hopeless, right, on their journey. For someone who's struggling with an eating disorder and they have ADHD and they're on their recovery journey and they feel really hopeless and they feel like it's too overwhelming to try to eat regularly, they're navigating the thoughts of like, I can't eat this, I can't eat that, right? All the mental gymnastics that comes with an eating disorder. Where does someone start, or what tool could you say give someone that can help them if they are in a place where everything just feels too overwhelming? They know the things they need to do. They can't do the things they need to do. And they feel stuck in their recovery journey. Like, where would you start around that place?
That's such a common challenge, right? Knowing what to do, but being unable to do it is the curse of ADHD. With that is really letting go and thinking about 2 things. 1, permission. Giving yourself unconditional permission to eat anything and everything. So no rules, All you need to do is put something in your mouth multiple times per day. People are going to hear me say this over and over again. It's what I say to my client. Your only rule, first thing, is how do you get yourself to eat every 3 to 4 hours? And that's it. If you're not doing that, that's all you focus on. If you're trying to do that and you can't, that is when you need to get external help, because that is the foundation. And if you can't do the foundation, you're not going to be able to do the rest. You need to go and get dietetic support. If you are eating regularly, it's working on that permission with food, making sure that that's not blocking you, making sure that you're eating enough. Those are the main places to start learning about how to give permission, intuitive eating, that sort of stuff. Just depends on whether you want to do it alone or with somebody. Honestly, I wish I just did it with somebody. I spent years trying to figure it out on my own, going through this like phases of pseudo recovery, thinking that I was fine, and then I wasn't, and I learned that I had to do more, and it would have been so much faster and easier if I had just worked with somebody. And I know that when you came to me, you were kind of in that place. You had done all this work and you had got support, but you were kind of like in pseudo recovery. And you're like, something is still there, but I don't know what it is. And then it was only with working with somebody again where you're like, oh, I see what it is. Now I can move past it, instead of trying to figure it out by yourself for however long.
Yeah. And I even remember I'm like, yep, I'm all good. I'm fine. And then it's like, you just slip back into the same old patterns and behaviors. And then in turn, I just ended up getting worse. And I was like, no, I can do this on my own. Like, I only ended up getting worse. And that's when I was like, I actually need someone, in this journey on me and I like with me. And I think what made me, and I think there's so many things around mental health and getting support and help, is that shame around it, right? It's that shame around like, I don't want to say that I'm struggling with X, Y, and Z, or it's a typical, I guess, eating disorder picture of like, I'm not sick enough, right? I'm not sick enough to get help. I don't need to get help. In my own journey, I was studying nutrition and I was struggling with an eating disorder. So it's like, I knew all the things, right? I knew all the nutrition things. I knew everything I quote unquote needed to do, but it's like, I couldn't actually do it myself because there was so many other factors that was playing into that. And I guess that's kind of one area where people can get stuck on their journey, is like not getting that help and support. Do you think there's any other areas when it comes to ADHD and eating disorders where people go wrong on their journey?
Thinking that they just need to know more and more about nutrition. Stop information hoarding. They try to learn as much as they can. They're like, if only I knew more about nutrition, then I would be able to eat better. It's not the knowledge. If anything, the knowledge is being used as ammunition against you. You're using it like your diet police is going, I know all of this stuff and you're not doing it. You suck. So stop trying to learn about nutrition. Stop trying to learn more and start to do more. Actually take the action, do the stuff, rip back all of the complexity. You're so busy focusing on, am I getting enough protein? Am I getting enough vitamin A? Who cares? Are you eating enough? Are you eating often enough? Are you working on your mindset? Focus on the bigger picture, not these tiny little minute details that actually are making it harder for yourself. So looking for a meal plan, thinking the next meal plan or next challenge or whatever is going to fix you, instead of focusing on the long game, focusing on getting support and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I definitely think with even clients that I work with, there is a lot of fear around eating potentially too much salt, right? Eating too much fat, eating too much X, Y, and Z, or it's potentially this obsession. And I know in my own journey, it was an obsession over eating enough protein, right? Every meal had to have X amount of protein, and I couldn't ever eat a meal that was lower in protein. Potentially I was at a friend's house and we were having some, vegetarian pasta, right? Like it was like in my head where I'm like, oh my gosh, I need protein, I need protein, I need protein. And it's that obsessive kind of thinking around like nutrition and all the tiny little things. And it kind of comes back to that whole picture. This is even what I say to my clients, and it's similar to what you said previously, is at the end of the day, like food, nutrition, it's important. We're not going to completely ignore the fact that yes, we need enough protein, fats, carbohydrates. But I'm more worried about your relationship to the food than the actual food you're eating. The stress of what you're eating and all this stress over all the little things is actually doing more harm to your body than potentially eating the cake or eating the X, Y, and Z. And I think that can be a common picture that displays, I know with my own clients. Where do you kind of actually then start doing the education? And when do you kind of start implementing, I guess, more of those strategies around reframing, and challenging, and I guess more of that cognitive stuff that, as we mentioned earlier, that can be really challenging when you're in that flight and flight state. So when it comes to working and navigating with someone that has ADHD, where is it appropriate for those kind of conversations to come into the picture to help them also on a whole be able to move through, the food rules and all these different things?
Basically, what I find is starts from day one. From the very first session, we're already talking about your food beliefs, your food rules, and where they're coming from and the why. And a big important question I ask my clients to do pretty much, I think from session 1 or 2, is start to ask themselves before every single meal, what is the purpose of this meal right now? What is this trying to achieve? So thinking about your pasta situation, if you had asked yourself, what is the purpose of this meal? Your disordered brain might just be like, I need to just get nutrition. But the non-disordered brain, the more rational version of you is going, the purpose of this meal is to connect with my friend right now and to enjoy food. We talk about all the different purposes of food and how it's not just about nutrition. It's not just about protein and calories or whatever it is. It is about connection and it is about enjoyment and how important it is for food to satisfy your brain as well. Understanding that it needs to satisfy sensory needs, get crunch. And if you don't get these, you're going to feel unsatisfied and you're just not a robot. So that conversation around what is the purpose of food? What does it mean to you? What is your goal? Working through your challenges, that starts immediately. That will all be going on in the background. So changing that your beliefs around food while kind of during in the first phase of my work with somebody, while I am making sure that their nutrition foundations are good enough. Not perfect. There's no meal plans. I am making sure that it is good enough. You're putting something in your mouth multiple times a day so that we know there is no physical reasons that you are struggling with food, that what is left over is all either emotional or logistical. So we work through the logistics all while working through a relationship with food. From there, you then go into the emotional stuff. You then start talking about reframing. Okay, we know all of your food rules. This is where it's negatively impacting your eating. You now see that this has become a trigger. You see your patterns in the first phase. Then you go into, is this helpful or unhelpful? Really important, really helpful question I ask my clients, especially ADHDers, is when they're identifying these thoughts in their brain, not asking themselves, is it true or not? Because you're going to find a way to tell yourself that it is true that you are a gross piece of crap and everyone hates you. You're going to be able to find a rationale for that. It's not asking if it's true or not. It's asking, is it helpful? And seeing the pattern. When you look in the mirror and you go, I'm so gross. Is it true? It doesn't matter. If it is true, there's nothing you can do about it right now. Worst case scenario, you are gross and there's nothing you can do. However, is it helpful? No. Why? Because it leads to you feeling dysregulated, upset. And then what happens? Then you eat, try to restrict. And then what happens? Then I binge. Pretty unhelpful, it's creating a negative feedback loop. So then you kind of go, well, how do we make that thought change or stop without gaslighting yourself? You don't go, oh, I'm so gross. And instead go, no, I'm not. I'm beautiful and empowered. You just go, I feel really gross right now. However, I know that thought isn't helpful and trying to fix the gross by restricting isn't helpful. So I'm going to not do that. So I'm going to break that cycle. While that's happening, that's the cognitive behavioral therapy. We're also seeing where the emotional dysregulation is negatively impacting that. And that comes in the DBT. So that is then your emergency tools. If you can't think logically, you're looking at them and going, oh my gosh, I'm so gross. You're throwing all the clothes out of your wardrobe, trying to find something to wear. All you need to know right now is food and body is never an emergency. There is never a point in your life where food, what you eat, how much you eat, or what you look like and what you wear is a literal emergency unless you have an allergy. So if you ever feel like it's an emergency, that's your red flag to go, I'm dysregulated. I'm in the orange zone. I need to get out of my brain into my body, use my emergency tools, get myself out of the orange so that I can utilize my CBT skills, reframing, etc. So that's what phase 2 is all about. How do you cope? How do you survive? How do you use your tools, work with your brain? Only then do I then go into how do you work on impulsivity? How do you start to eat healthier in a way that's not going to cause restriction or overthinking? Because you can't do that if you don't have the skills to work on what if you screw up? What if you do eat the thing when you wanted to eat the vegetable, whatever it is? You need to have those skills to start eating healthier without getting disordered again.
Amazing. And I think I love how you even like mentioned how eating, there's so much more to eating and food than just food, right? There's the social side, the emotional side, the connection side. Like there's all these factors to it, and really like bringing it back to that, I think is really encouraging for people on their journey, because it helps to just broaden their perspective of like what food is and the role that food plays within them. And I even loved how you talk through the different phases that you do work through with your clients, and how you navigate that in a way where it's not just doing one thing and then not discussing whatever. It's kind of all going along in the background, but obviously there's different things that you're going to pull from and strengthen in different phases. And I know that you do run a course where you kind of go through these phases. I would love, as we kind of come to the end of this conversation and the end of, I know that our listeners have probably gotten so much information from everything you have shared. So thank you so much for even joining us today and being a part of this conversation. But where can people find more about what you have to offer them if they do hear about what you're saying and they see different parts of themselves in different things that you have said today, and they're like, I am struggling with ADHD, an eating disorder, binge eating, and I need more support, more help?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to say, I also really love our catch ups, like bouncing ideas off you, because you have some different ideas from me as well. And I can learn from you as well. You were kind of work in a different field. And so it's always interesting for us to come together and me being like, well, this is how I do it with my clients who have binge eating disorder. What do you think would be the challenges that would come up with that for anorexia specifically? Because even though all eating disorders do have sort of the core foundation of I'm trying to figure out how to cope, and controlling food and body is the way that I do that, ultimately the different presentations can impact how you use those tools. So I have to say, I learned from you as well. But yeah, as I was kind of saying, the way that I work with people is I've noticed there tends to be 3 phases. And so I've created 2 programs, and they're both called the Binge Free and Beyond program. And they both go through the 3 phases. My initial program that I had was specifically for binge eating disorder or disordered eating. And it's for people who are feeling very distressed with food. And it kind of runs for 6 months. And it's guiding you through. It's not like teaching you what to do, because you know what to do. You just want to figure out how to do it. It's guiding you through step by step and making sure whatever changes and growth that you have actually stick. So, you know how you were saying that you did all this work, but it all just kind of hung around in the background and it didn't quite stick. And then you had to go and do more work. Now, don't get me wrong, the work's never finished per se. However, my big goal for the program is to change the way that your brain thinks about food and your body forever, to really lay those foundations so that 2 years down the track and this happens, you'll be messaging me, my clients will message me and go, you're still growing and you're still learning without having to do more, significantly more work sort of thing. So that's my big program. That's the 6-month, the one-on-one program. And then my other program, which I've created, so this is much newer, is specifically for ADHD. So as you can see, for ADHD, there are much more specific common challenges that come up, and a lot of them are around logistics. And so my 3-month program is a lot more faster paced, a lot more logistically focused, but it still goes through those 3 phases, and it runs for 3 months instead of 6 months. So it's a really great start for if you have ADHD, you feel like you know what to do, you're feeling out of control with food, but you just need someone to coach you through, make you do the step by step that's tedious and sucks and you can't do by yourself. So those are my 2 main programs. You can sign up through the link in my bio on my program. You can also send me an email on nutritionparlor@gmail.com, and that's parlor with a PARLOUR. And then what I do is I offer a free call to see what is the better support program for you.
Yeah, amazing. And I'll definitely leave all your links down in the description where people can find out more about your programs, who you are, or even just follow you on Instagram. And again, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate everything you do for me outside of this podcast, but also I really appreciate you spending your time to come on today and to share this with our listeners, because I know they will definitely take so much away from this. But to finish off today's podcast, I thank everyone for tuning in today to In Conversation with Christina. If you did find today's episode helpful, don't forget to subscribe and share it with someone that might find it benefits from this conversation. But otherwise, I will see you next week in the next episode.